King Stephen of England, circa 1096 to 1154, was a ruler whose reign was defined by political turmoil, civil war, and a relentless struggle for power. Ascending to the throne in 1135 after the death of his uncle, Henry I, Stephen's claim was immediately contested by Empress Matilda, Henry's daughter and designated heir. This dispute led to a period of chaos known as the Anarchy, 1135 to 1153, a brutal civil war that plunged England into years of unrest, shifting alliances, and military conflict. Despite being known for his chivalrous nature and personal bravery, Stephen's reign was marked by instability, weakened royal authority, and constant battles to secure his rule. His inability to fully suppress opposition or maintain loyalty among the nobility ultimately forced him to negotiate peace. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Wallingford, 1153, in which Stephen recognized Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II, as his heir, ensuring the continuation of the Angevin dynasty. King Stephen's reign remains one of the most tumultuous and complex chapters in English history, a time of fractured loyalties, shifting power struggles, and the fragile nature of monarchy. Early life, 1097 to 1135. Childhood and family background. Stephen was born in Blois, France, sometime between 1092 and 1096, into a family of considerable political and military influence. His father, Stephen Henry, Count of Blois and Chartres, was a powerful French noble and a participant in the First Crusade. However, after gaining a reputation for cowardice, Stephen Henry embarked on a second expedition to the Levant in 1101, where he was killed at the Battle of Ramla. His mother, Adela of Normandy, was the daughter of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders. Known for her piety and strong will, Adela played a formative role in shaping Stephen's character and ambitions. It was largely at her insistence that Stephen Henry returned to the Levant, seeking to redeem his honor. She outlived her husband and remained a dominant figure in Stephen's life, even witnessing his rise to the English throne before her death in 1137. Political landscape of France. Stephen was born into a fractured and highly competitive political world. 12th century France was a patchwork of independent counties and duchies, loosely under the nominal rule of the King of France. The Ile-de-France, controlled by the Capetian monarchy, was the center of royal authority, but much of the surrounding territory, including Blois, was governed by ambitious noble families. To the west, the Angevin territories of Maine, Anjou, and Touraine vied for power, while to the north, the Duchy of Normandy remained embroiled in struggles over the Anglo-Norman inheritance. The descendants of William the Conqueror fought bitterly over control of both England and Normandy, leading to constant warfare and shifting alliances. In this volatile landscape, castles and fortresses were critical centers of power, and noble families competed fiercely to expand their domains. Siblings and upbringing. Stephen was one of several children, growing up alongside at least 4 brothers and a sister, with 2 possible half-sisters. His eldest brother, William, was the natural heir to Blois and Chartres, but he was likely intellectually disabled, leading Adela to pass the inheritance to her second son, Theobald, who later became Count of Champagne. Another older brother, Odo, died young, leaving Stephen and his younger brother, Henry, to forge their own paths. Adela played a strategic role in guiding her sons' futures. She encouraged Stephen to pursue the life of a feudal knight and noble, while Henry was steered toward a career in the church, possibly to prevent rivalry between the brothers. Unlike many noble children, Stephen was raised within his mother's household rather than being sent to a relative's court. Under the tutelage of William the Norman, he received a thorough education, learning Latin, riding, and military skills, while also studying recent history and biblical stories. This well-rounded upbringing prepared him for the turbulent political career that lay ahead. Relationship with Henry I. Stephen's early years were deeply shaped by his relationship with his uncle, King Henry I of England. Following the death of William Rufus in 1100, Henry seized the English throne, later invading Normandy in 1106 and defeating his elder brother, Robert Curthose, at the Battle of Tinchebray. This victory placed Normandy under Henry's control but also triggered conflict with King Louis VI of France, who supported Robert's son, William Clito, as Duke of Normandy. The resulting power struggle led to years of regional warfare, affecting Stephen's early career. Adela and Theobald of Blois aligned themselves with Henry, further cementing the family's connection to the English king. Recognizing Henry's growing influence, Adela sent Stephen to his uncle's court, where he gained military and political experience. By 1112, Stephen was knighted by Henry, likely after participating in the king's Norman campaigns against rebels led by Robert of Bellême. He was also present at court in 1113, accompanying Henry to the Abbey of St. Evroul. Around this time, Stephen likely visited England for the first time, possibly in 1113 or 1115, as part of Henry's retinue. Henry quickly became a key patron for Stephen, offering him wealth and status while ensuring that he remained dependent on royal favor. As the third surviving son of a noble house, Stephen had limited inheritance prospects and required a powerful benefactor to secure his future. Henry, in turn, saw Stephen as a useful ally, loyal, ambitious, but not powerful enough to be a threat to either himself or his heir, William Adelin. Under Henry's patronage, Stephen amassed considerable lands and titles. After the Battle of Tinchebray, Henry confiscated the county of Mortain from his cousin and seized the honour of Eye from Robert Mallet. By 1113, he granted both to Stephen, though without some of the associated lands in England. Stephen was further rewarded with the honour of Lancaster, taken from Roger the Poitevin, and received lands in Alençon in southern Normandy. However, his hold over Alençon was short-lived, as local Normans revolted with support from Fulk IV, Count of Anjou. Stephen and his brother Theobald launched a campaign to reclaim the lands but suffered a significant defeat at the Battle of Alençon, ultimately failing to restore their control. The White Ship disaster and the succession crisis. In 1120, a catastrophic event reshaped the future of England. The White Ship, carrying over 300 passengers, set sail from Barfleur, Normandy, bound for England. Among the travellers was William Adelin, the only legitimate son and heir of King Henry I, accompanied by numerous high-ranking nobles. Stephen had been scheduled to board the vessel but decided at the last moment to wait for another ship, either due to concerns over overcrowding or because he was suffering from a sudden illness. This decision would prove pivotal to his future. The White Ship sank en route, and all but one of the passengers perished, including William Adelin. The death of William Adelin plunged England into a succession crisis. The rules of inheritance in 12th century Western Europe remained uncertain and inconsistent. In parts of France, male primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited all titles, was gaining acceptance, but England and Normandy traditionally divided lands among sons, with the eldest receiving the core patrimony and younger sons taking lesser holdings. However, the Anglo-Norman world had never witnessed an uncontested succession. William the Conqueror had claimed the throne through military conquest, and his sons, Robert Curthose and William Rufus, had waged war for control, with the younger Rufus emerging victorious. Henry I himself had only secured Normandy by force. With William Adelin dead, Henry's only other legitimate child was Empress Matilda, but as a woman, she faced significant political challenges. In 1121, Henry married Adelisa of Louvain, hoping to father another son, yet the union remained childless. By 1127, it became clear that Matilda was Henry's chosen heir. However, her political position was fragile. She had been Holy Roman Empress by marriage to Emperor Henry V, but following his death in 1125, she wed Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, in 1128. This alliance was deeply unpopular among the Anglo-Norman nobility, as the Angevins were historic rivals of the Normans. At the same time, resentment toward Henry's governance was growing, particularly over his heavy taxation and military expenditures. Despite these tensions, Henry's personal authority kept rebellion at bay, for the time being. Meanwhile, Henry arranged a strategic marriage for Stephen. In 1125, Stephen wed Matilda of Boulogne, the sole heir of Eustace III, Count of Boulogne. This union greatly enhanced Stephen's power, as Boulogne controlled a critical continental port and extensive estates in northwestern and southeastern England. His growing influence was soon tested when William Clito, the son of Robert Curthose and a potential rival for the throne, was poised to become Count of Flanders. In 1127, Henry dispatched Stephen to block William's ascension, and though Stephen's intervention was successful, William retaliated by attacking Boulogne. The conflict ended in a truce, but fortune once again favored Stephen. William Clito died in 1128, removing one more obstacle from Stephen's potential path to power. By 1135, Stephen had secured a formidable position within Anglo-Norman society. He was one of the wealthiest nobles, widely respected for his charitable piety and approachable demeanor, yet also regarded as a man of decisive action. Despite lingering rumors of cowardice surrounding his father, Stephen had cultivated an image of strength and reliability, making him a favored figure among the nobility. His marriage to Matilda of Boulogne had further enhanced his influence, placing his household among the richest in England, second only to the royal family. Meanwhile, his younger brother, Henry of Blois, had risen to extraordinary power within the church, holding both the Abbey of Glastonbury and the Bishopric of Winchester, making him the second richest man in England after the king. Henry of Blois was also a determined advocate for greater church independence, a stance that would shape the politics of Stephen's reign. As Henry I's health declined, he sought to secure his daughter Matilda's claim to the throne, forcing his barons to swear repeated oaths of loyalty, first in 1127, then again in 1128 and 1131. Stephen had been among those who took the oath, acknowledging Matilda as Henry's heir. However, by 1135, relations between Henry, Matilda, and her husband Geoffrey Plantagenet had become increasingly strained. Suspicious that they lacked genuine support in England, Matilda and Geoffrey pressed Henry to transfer key royal castles in Normandy to them before his death, effectively forcing the nobility to swear allegiance immediately. Henry, wary that Geoffrey might seize power prematurely, angrily refused. As tensions escalated, a rebellion broke out in southern Normandy, forcing Henry into yet another military confrontation. In the midst of this campaign, the king unexpectedly fell ill and died near Lyons-la-Forêt. News of Henry I's death spread quickly, yet Matilda and Geoffrey were in Anjou, awkwardly entangled in supporting Norman rebels against the royal forces, a situation that kept many of Matilda's own supporters, including Robert of Gloucester, from immediately acting on her behalf. Meanwhile, Stephen's elder brother, Theobald, was still in Blois, too far away to seize the initiative. Stephen, however, was perfectly positioned. He was in Boulogne, near England, and ready to act. The moment he received word of Henry's death, he set sail for England with his military household. Upon arriving in England, Stephen faced resistance. The ports of Dover and Canterbury were under the control of Robert of Gloucester, who may have initially denied him access. Nevertheless, Stephen reached London by December 8, and over the next week, he moved decisively to seize the throne. The citizens of London, claiming their traditional right to elect the king, proclaimed Stephen monarch, anticipating that he would grant them new privileges and legal protections in return. His brother Henry of Blois then delivered the support of the church, an essential step in securing the crown. Riding this wave of momentum, Stephen advanced to Winchester, where Roger, Bishop of Salisbury, who controlled the royal treasury, handed over its contents. On December 15, Henry of Blois brokered a formal agreement. In exchange for Stephen granting extensive privileges to the church, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the papal legate would recognize his claim to the throne. Though Stephen had previously sworn an oath to Matilda, Henry argued that the oath had been coerced, and more importantly, that maintaining stability justified breaking it. Additionally, Hugh Bigod, Henry I's former royal steward, swore that on his deathbed, the late king had changed his mind, naming Stephen as his successor instead. With church backing and noble support, Stephen was crowned at Westminster Abbey on December 22, 1135. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Norman nobility convened at Le Neubourg, debating whether to declare Theobald king, reasoning that as the elder grandson of William the Conqueror, he had the strongest claim. Theobald met with Robert of Gloucester and the Norman barons on December 21, appearing poised to secure their backing. However, news suddenly arrived that Stephen's coronation was happening the next day. Theobald hesitated, and with the reality of Stephen's rapidly solidifying power in England, his support collapsed overnight. In the end, Stephen financially compensated his brother, who chose to remain in Blois, endorsing Stephen's rule. With England secured, Stephen now turned to Normandy, where the nobility had yet to be brought fully under his control, and where Matilda still had a powerful base of support. The first challenge of his reign had only just begun. A kingdom in unrest, 1136 to 1139. Stephen's early reign was marked by instability, as various factions tested his rule across England, Wales, and Normandy. The Anglo-Norman kingdom he had inherited was a product of the Norman conquest of 1066, shaped by a delicate balance of power between a small elite of major barons who controlled land on both sides of the English Channel. Beneath them, lesser barons held more localized estates, often vulnerable to shifts in royal favor. The question of whether land and titles should pass strictly by inheritance or remain at the king's discretion had become a growing source of tension, intensified under Henry I, who had preferred to appoint new men to powerful positions rather than relying solely on the old nobility. Henry's financial policies had left the monarchy wealthy and efficient, but his strong central authority had bred resentment that now threatened Stephen's reign. Scottish invasion and the Northern Campaign. Stephen's first major test came from David I of Scotland, who, upon hearing of Henry I's death, launched an invasion into northern England, seizing Carlisle, Newcastle, and key strongholds in Northumbria. The Scottish king had long-standing claims to Cumberland, and through his marriage to Waltheof's daughter, he had also staked a claim to Northumbria. Unwilling to allow Scotland to expand unchecked, Stephen gathered an army and marched north, confronting David at Durham. The two rulers negotiated a settlement. David returned most of the occupied lands, keeping only Carlisle, while Stephen recognized David's son, Henry, as the Earl of Huntingdon, securing a temporary peace. Though the agreement prevented an immediate crisis, David would continue to challenge Stephen's rule in the coming years, as the question of Northumbria remained unresolved. Royal Court at Westminster, 1136. Having secured the north, Stephen returned to Westminster to hold his first royal court at Easter. The event was intended to solidify his legitimacy among the Anglo-Norman elite, and it drew a wide array of powerful nobles and clergy. To reassure his barons and bishops, Stephen issued a royal charter, reaffirming his commitment to the church, promising to reform royal forest laws, and curbing some of the more oppressive legal measures introduced by Henry I. The court was lavish, featuring extravagant gifts, fine clothing, and grand ceremonies, reinforcing Stephen's image as a generous and magnanimous ruler. However, Stephen's legitimacy still required papal approval. His brother, Henry of Blois, played a key role in securing it, using his influence to obtain supportive testimonies from Theobald of Blois and King Louis VI of France. Pope Innocent II officially recognized Stephen's rule later that year, and copies of the papal letter were widely circulated to strengthen his claim to the throne. Rebellion in Wales, 1136–1137. Despite Stephen's initial diplomatic successes, trouble erupted in Wales. Following a Welsh victory at the Battle of Llwchwr in January 1136, the region erupted into open rebellion. The uprising gained momentum after the murder of Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare in April, and soon Owain Gwynedd and Gruffydd ap Rhys had seized significant territories, including Carmarthen Castle. Stephen responded by dispatching Richard's brother, Baldwin, and the Marcher Lord Robert Fitz-Harold of Uyers to crush the revolt. However, both campaigns ended in failure, and by 1137, Stephen abandoned efforts to retake the region, choosing instead to focus on other threats. Historian David Crouch later remarked that Stephen effectively bowed out of Wales, prioritizing the more pressing conflicts elsewhere in his kingdom. Revolts and political unrest. At the same time, two noble rebellions erupted in the southwest, led by Baldwin de Redvers and Robert of Bampton. Though Stephen successfully put down both revolts, Baldwin was released after his capture, a decision that would later haunt Stephen, as Baldwin fled to Normandy and became one of the king's most vocal critics. Stephen also faced increasing hostility from powerful barons, many of whom had favored Matilda's claim to the throne but had initially accepted Stephen's rule out of pragmatism. However, his generous granting of lands and titles to allies began to alienate some older nobility, who felt marginalized under his reign. The struggle for Normandy, 1136–1137. Stephen's control of Normandy was far from secure. In early 1136, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, launched an invasion of the duchy, carrying out raids and burning estates rather than attempting to hold land. While Stephen was occupied in England, he appointed Waleran de Beaumont as his lieutenant in Normandy, while his brother Theobald led the defense of the region. In 1137, Stephen finally traveled to Normandy, meeting with Louis VI of France and Theobald of Blois. They negotiated an informal regional alliance, likely orchestrated by Henry of Blois, to counterbalance Angevin expansion. As part of the deal, Louis VI recognized Stephen's son, Eustace, as the Duke of Normandy, in exchange for Eustace swearing fealty to the French king. However, despite these political maneuvers, Stephen failed to reclaim Argentan, a key province on the Normandy-Anjou border, which Geoffrey had seized in late 1135. When Stephen assembled an army to retake the territory, conflict broke out between his Flemish mercenaries, led by William of Ypres, and the Norman barons, culminating in a battle between his own forces. The Normans deserted him, forcing Stephen to abandon the campaign. With no other options, he negotiated a truce, agreeing to pay Geoffrey 2,000 marks annually in exchange for peace along the Norman border. An unstable kingdom. By 1137, it was clear that Stephen's authority was fragile. Though he had managed to secure papal recognition, suppress rebellions in England, and forge alliances in Normandy, the cracks in his rule were becoming evident. He had lost control of Wales, struggled to defend Normandy, and faced growing opposition from barons frustrated with his leadership. His early reign had been defined by crisis management, but as tensions continued to rise, it became increasingly clear that his rule would soon be tested in a far greater struggle, the civil war against Matilda, known as the Anarchy. Early reign, 1136 to 1139. Initial years, 1136 to 1137. Upon taking the throne, Stephen inherited a kingdom shaped by the Norman conquest of 1066 and the subsequent Norman expansion into South Wales. His Anglo-Norman realm was dominated by a select group of powerful barons, many of whom held lands on both sides of the English Channel. Beneath them were lesser nobles whose holdings were more localized. However, tensions persisted over whether land and titles should be inherited or granted by the king, an issue that had grown particularly contentious during the reign of Henry I. In Normandy, hereditary rights were more firmly established, while in England, land ownership was less secure. Back in the south, Stephen held his first royal court at Westminster during Easter 1136, gathering prominent Anglo-Norman barons and church leaders. Seeking to reinforce his legitimacy, he issued a new royal charter promising to reverse unpopular forest laws and address legal grievances. He portrayed himself as Henry I's rightful successor and confirmed the 7 existing earldoms. The lavish event, marked by extravagant spending, gifts, and grants of land, was part of Stephen's broader effort to solidify support. His accession still required papal approval, which his brother Henry of Blois helped secure. Pope Innocent II later confirmed Stephen as king, and copies of this declaration were widely circulated to reinforce his legitimacy. Despite these efforts, unrest persisted. In Wales, a rebellion erupted after Welsh forces defeated the Normans at the Battle of Llewchwr in early 1136. The uprising spread rapidly following the ambush and killing of Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare. Owain Gwynedd and Gruffydd ap Rhys took advantage of the situation, capturing significant territories, including Carmarthen Castle. Stephen's attempts to subdue Wales, led by Baldwin Fitzgilbert and Robert Fitzharold, proved ineffective, and by the end of 1137, he effectively abandoned efforts to reclaim control. Meanwhile, in the southwest, Stephen crushed 2 smaller revolts, one led by Baldwin de Redvers and the other by Robert of Bampton. Baldwin, after being released, fled to Normandy, where he became an outspoken critic of the king. Normandy itself was under threat. Geoffrey of Anjou invaded twice in 1136, employing a strategy of raiding and burning rather than attempting to hold territory. Unable to leave England, Stephen entrusted the Dutch's defence to Waleran de Beaumont and his brother Theobald. Stephen finally crossed to Normandy in 1137, where he secured an alliance with Louis VI of France and Theobald of Blois, balancing against Angevin influence. As part of this agreement, Louis recognized Stephen's son Eustace as Duke of Normandy in exchange for fealty. However, Stephen failed to reclaim the strategically important Argentan region, as divisions within his forces, particularly between his Flemish mercenaries and Norman barons, led to internal strife. Ultimately, Stephen was forced to negotiate peace, agreeing to pay Geoffrey of Anjou an annual tribute of 2,000 marks. Relations with the Church and the growing crisis. Stephen's relationship with the Church, initially strong, became increasingly strained. His 1136 royal charter had promised a review of land seized from the Church since 1087, but many of these estates were now in the hands of nobles unwilling to relinquish them. A dispute over lands in Devon, claimed by Stephen's brother Henry in his capacity as Abbot of Glastonbury, sparked local unrest. Matters worsened when Archbishop of Canterbury William de Corbet died in 1136. Stephen seized his wealth, angering senior clergy. Though Henry of Blois sought the archbishopric, Stephen instead backed Theobald of Bec, who was ultimately appointed. In response, the papacy named Henry papal legate, possibly as compensation for his loss. Despite these tensions, Stephen's early years as king had notable successes. He stabilized the Scottish border, contained Geoffrey of Anjou's incursions, secured peace with France, and maintained broad baronial support. However, underlying problems loomed. David of Scotland retained control over much of northern England, Wales remained in rebellion, and the costly Norman conflicts had destabilized the duchy. Furthermore, many barons felt Stephen had not rewarded them adequately, and his financial situation became dire. The immense treasury Henry I had left was depleted by 1138 due to lavish court expenses and the need to fund mercenary forces. Defending the kingdom, 1138 to 1139. The situation deteriorated in 1138 when Robert, Earl of Gloucester, Henry I's illegitimate son and half-brother of Empress Matilda, openly rebelled. Robert, a skilled statesman and military leader, had always been a potential threat. Although he had initially attended Stephen's court, he declared his allegiance to Matilda in 1138, triggering revolts in Kent and the southwest. Meanwhile, Geoffrey of Anjou launched another invasion of Normandy, and David I of Scotland again pushed into northern England, this time in Matilda's name. Stephen faced a three-front conflict. Anglo-Norman warfare of this period was dominated by castle sieges rather than open battles. Castles, particularly the newer stone keeps, were difficult to assault directly. Commanders relied on attrition tactics, starvation sieges or undermining walls, rather than costly frontal assaults. The high cost of warfare placed even greater strain on Stephen's finances, forcing him to rely increasingly on mercenaries. Despite these challenges, Stephen responded with impressive speed. His wife, Queen Matilda, was dispatched to Kent with forces to reclaim Dover. Meanwhile, in the north, the Archbishop of York, Thursdayton, rallied local forces and decisively defeated David's army at the Battle of the Standard in August 1138. However, David retained control over much of Northumbria. In the west, Stephen launched a campaign into the Welsh Marches, capturing Hereford and Shrewsbury before advancing on Bath. Though unable to take the stronghold of Bristol, he devastated the surrounding area, weakening the rebellion. Meanwhile, Matilda's forces successfully reclaimed Dover. With the military situation improving, Stephen negotiated peace with Scotland. His wife brokered the Treaty of Durham, granting Northumbria and Cumbria to David and his son Henry in exchange for their loyalty. However, this angered Ranulph, Earl of Chester, who saw himself as the rightful lord of these lands. Nevertheless, Stephen could now focus on preparing for an imminent invasion by Robert and Matilda. Prelude to Civil War, 1139. Anticipating a major conflict, Stephen created several new earldoms to secure support. Under Henry I, earldoms had been rare and mostly symbolic, but Stephen granted them to men he considered loyal military commanders. Many of these new earldoms, such as Worcester, Leicester, Hereford, Warwick, and Pembroke, were given to members of the Beaumont family, led by the influential Waleran de Beaumont. This created a strategic buffer zone to defend against Matilda's supporters. However, Waleran's growing influence made it risky for anyone at court to oppose him. Stephen's most controversial move came in June 1139, when he arrested Roger, Bishop of Salisbury, along with his nephews, Bishops Alexander of Lincoln and Nigel of Ely. These bishops had accumulated extensive lands and begun fortifying castles, leading Stephen to suspect them of plotting against him. In a dramatic confrontation at Oxford, Stephen demanded the surrender of their castles. When Nigel refused, Stephen besieged Devizes Castle and threatened to execute Roger's son unless he complied. The bishops ultimately capitulated, but the move sparked outrage within the church. Henry of Blois, as papal legate, challenged Stephen's actions, calling for a church council to investigate. Stephen defended his decision, arguing that the bishops had been acting as barons, not clergy. Despite appeals to Rome, Stephen's case prevailed, and the matter was dropped. However, this episode severely damaged his standing with the church, including his brother Henry. With Matilda's invasion imminent, England teetered on the brink of civil war. The Civil War, 1139 to 1154. The beginning of the conflict, 1139 to 1140. In 1139, the long-anticipated Angevin invasion of England finally commenced. Baldwin de Redvers made the first move, attempting to seize Wareham as a landing point for Empress Matilda's forces. However, King Stephen's army swiftly countered, forcing Baldwin to retreat westward. Shortly after, Empress Matilda, accompanied by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, landed at Arundel on the 30th of September with 140 knights, having been invited by King Henry I's widow, Adeliza. While Matilda sought refuge in Arundel Castle, Robert marched toward Wallingford and Bristol, rallying support and securing an alliance with the formidable Miles of Gloucester, who promptly abandoned his loyalty to Stephen. Acting swiftly, Stephen laid siege to Arundel, trapping Matilda inside. However, in a surprising turn, he agreed to a truce brokered by his brother, Henry, the Bishop of Winchester. The details of the agreement remain obscure, but its outcome was clear. Stephen lifted the siege, allowing Matilda to join Robert unscathed. Historians speculate that Stephen may have viewed Robert as the true threat rather than Matilda, or that he hesitated to commit his forces to a prolonged siege of the near-impregnable Arundel castle. Others suggest that chivalry played a role, as Stephen was known for his courteous nature, and attacking a noblewoman was against the conventions of Anglo-Norman warfare. With Matilda now free to consolidate her support in the southwest, Stephen turned his focus to reclaiming control. Though defections to Matilda's cause remained relatively scarce, her supporters commanded a significant stronghold stretching from Gloucester and Bristol through the Welsh marches and as far east as Oxford and Wallingford. Stephen made an initial attempt to take Wallingford Castle, but its defences held firm. He then pressed westward, capturing several fortresses before turning back to counter an aggressive offensive from Miles of Gloucester, who was advancing toward London. Forced to abandon his campaign, Stephen redirected his forces to secure his capital. By early 1140, fresh revolts erupted. Nigel, Bishop of Ely, whose castle Stephen had confiscated the previous year, launched a rebellion in East Anglia, fortifying himself in the Isle of Ely, a naturally defensible position surrounded by marshland. In response, Stephen orchestrated a bold assault, constructing a makeshift causeway of lashed-together boats to launch a surprise attack. Nigel barely escaped, but his stronghold fell, restoring order in the east, for the time being. Meanwhile, Robert of Gloucester's forces retook key territories Stephen had previously seized, prolonging the struggle. Attempts at diplomacy proved futile. At a peace conference in Bath, Henry of Blois, Stephen's brother and the papal legate, sought reconciliation, but negotiations collapsed when the clergy insisted on dictating the terms. Tensions further escalated when Ranulph of Chester, furious over Stephen's decision to grant northern lands to Prince Henry of Scotland, seized Lincoln Castle in a sudden coup. Though Stephen initially agreed to a truce, he soon saw an opportunity for retaliation. Upon learning that Ranulph and his family had lowered their guard, he launched a swift counterattack. However, Ranulph managed to escape and officially declared for Matilda, forcing Stephen to lay siege to Lincoln. The turning point, 1141 to 1142. While Stephen besieged Lincoln in early 1141, Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester advanced with a superior force. Faced with the decision to fight or withdraw, Stephen chose battle. On the 2nd of February, 1141, the Battle of Lincoln unfolded. Stephen commanded his infantry at the centre, with Alan of Brittany on his right and William of Ormale on his left. Though initially successful in repelling Welsh infantry, Stephen's forces were soon overwhelmed. Encircled and abandoned by many of his allies, the king fought desperately, wielding his sword until it shattered, then continuing with a battle-axe. Ultimately, he was captured and taken to Gloucester, before being imprisoned in Bristol Castle under increasingly harsh conditions. With Stephen in chains, Matilda moved to claim the throne. She secured the support of Bishop Henry of Winchester, who declared her Lady of England and Normandy. In turn, she granted him sweeping control over church affairs. Stephen's treasury, though meagre, was handed over, and his remaining loyalists were excommunicated. However, when Matilda entered London in June for her coronation, the city erupted in rebellion, forcing her to flee to Oxford. Stephen's captivity triggered further shifts in power. His brother Theobald of Blois, preoccupied with conflicts in France, withheld support, while Geoffrey of Anjou, Matilda's husband, seized Normandy unopposed. Even staunch royalist nobles began reconsidering their allegiances. Waleran de Beaumont defected to the Angevins, while others withdrew from the conflict altogether. The breakdown of centralized authority was evident as regional lords minted their own coins, further destabilizing the realm. Yet Stephen's faction did not collapse. His wife, Queen Matilda, proved instrumental in rallying his remaining supporters. With William of Ypres leading forces in London and William Martel commanding in the southwest, the Queen's camp resisted the Angevin advances. The tides shifted when Henry of Winchester, disgruntled with Matilda's governance, defected back to Stephen's cause. The decisive moment came in September 1141 at the rout of Winchester. As Matilda's forces besieged Bishop Henry's stronghold, the Queen's army launched a counteroffensive, forcing the Angevins into retreat. Robert of Gloucester was captured in the ensuing chaos, presenting an opportunity for negotiation. In a simple prisoner exchange, Stephen was freed on the 1st of November in return for Robert's release. Stephen wasted no time reclaiming authority. At Christmas 1141, he and Queen Matilda reaffirmed their rule with a second coronation. The war, however, was far from over. Stephen's resurgence, 1142. Early in 1142, Stephen fell gravely ill, leading to rumors of his death. Though he recovered, the episode exposed the fragility of his rule. By summer, he had regained enough strength to campaign against Angevin strongholds, recapturing several castles. A turning point emerged when Stephen spotted an opportunity to seize Empress Matilda herself. Matilda had taken refuge in Oxford, a well-fortified city protected by the river Isis. In a daring assault, Stephen led his troops across the icy river and stormed the town, trapping Matilda in the castle. With his rival cornered, victory seemed imminent. However, in the depths of winter, Matilda orchestrated a daring escape. Cloaked in white to blend with the snow, she slipped past Stephen's guards and fled across the frozen river to Wallingford. Oxford Castle surrendered soon after, but Stephen had missed his best chance to end the war. The conflict would drag on for another decade, with neither side able to secure decisive control. What began as a battle for the crown had now spiraled into a drawn-out struggle, leaving England fractured and war-torn. Stalemate and shifting tides, 1143 to 1146. By the mid-1140s, the Civil War had settled into a prolonged and exhausting stalemate. While neither side could secure outright victory in England, Geoffrey of Anjou was steadily consolidating his grip on Normandy. The year 1143 opened with a precarious situation for Stephen. Robert of Gloucester had besieged Wilton Castle, a key royalist stronghold in Herefordshire. As Stephen attempted to break out, the ensuing Battle of Wilton unfolded. Once again, the Angevin cavalry proved formidable, and for a moment, it seemed as if the king might be captured a second time. However, his steward, William Martel, fought a desperate rearguard action, allowing Stephen to escape. The king valued William's loyalty so highly that he later agreed to exchange Sherborne Castle for his safe release, one of the rare instances where Stephen conceded a castle to ransom a supporter. Later that year, a fresh crisis erupted in East Anglia. Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, whom Stephen had long distrusted, finally rose in rebellion. The conflict began when Stephen summoned Geoffrey to court and had him arrested, demanding the surrender of his castles, including the Tower of London, Saffron Walden, and Pleshy. Faced with execution, Geoffrey complied, but once freed, he fled to the Isle of Ely, from where he waged a relentless guerrilla campaign against Cambridge, aiming to push south toward London. With Hugh Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, already in open revolt, Stephen lacked the resources to hunt Geoffrey down. Instead, he focused on constructing a defensive barrier of castles between Ely and London, including Burwell Castle, in an effort to contain the threat. Tensions escalated further in 1144 when Ranulph of Chester revolted once more, carving up Stephen's honour of Lancaster between himself and Prince Henry of Scotland. In the west, Robert of Gloucester and his allies continued raiding royalist lands, while Wallingford Castle remained a defiant Angevin stronghold, dangerously close to London. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Geoffrey of Anjou's campaign in Normandy reached its climax. In January 1144, he advanced into Rouen, the Duchy's capital, securing full control of the region. Shortly afterward, Louis VII of France formally recognized him as Duke of Normandy. By this point, Stephen's power relied increasingly on his closest household supporters, like William of Ypres, rather than the major barons who might have mustered larger armies. After the events of 1141, Stephen had largely abandoned his network of earls, favoring a tighter circle of loyal commanders. Yet despite these setbacks, the war began to shift slightly in Stephen's favor. Miles of Gloucester, one of the Angevin's most talented commanders, died unexpectedly in a hunting accident over Christmas 1143, weakening their position in the west. Geoffrey de Mandeville's rebellion dragged on until September 1144, when he was fatally wounded during an attack on Burwell Castle. By 1145, Stephen had regained some momentum, retaking Faringdon Castle in Oxfordshire. In the north, he reached a new agreement with Ranulph of Chester, but in 1146, he repeated the same trick he had played on Geoffrey de Mandeville 3 years earlier, inviting Ranulph to court, arresting him, and threatening execution unless he surrendered key castles, including Lincoln and Coventry. As before, Ranulph complied but immediately rebelled upon his release. However, this time, the situation remained at an impasse. Stephen lacked the forces to mount a northern campaign, while Ranulph no longer had the strongholds necessary to press an attack. Nevertheless, Stephen's tactic of summoning rebellious nobles to court only to imprison them had begun to damage his reputation. His increasingly authoritarian methods sowed distrust among the barons, further complicating his already tenuous rule. The final phases of the war, 1147 to 1152. By 1147, the prolonged conflict had left England battered and war-torn. Later Victorian historians would dub the period the Anarchy, and contemporary chronicles painted a bleak picture. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lamented that there was nothing but disturbance, wickedness, and robbery. Many parts of England, particularly Wiltshire, Berkshire, the Thames Valley, and East Anglia, had suffered extensive devastation. The breakdown of central authority led to a proliferation of adulterine, unauthorized, castles. Chronicler Robert of Torigny estimated their number at 1,115, likely an exaggeration, though even his lower estimate of 126 still reflected widespread disorder. The once unified royal coinage system splintered, with Stephen, the Empress, and numerous local lords minting their own currencies. The royal forest laws collapsed in much of the country. Despite this, certain regions remained relatively untouched. Stephen's territories in the southeast and the Angevin heartlands around Gloucester and Bristol saw little disruption. Meanwhile, David I of Scotland effectively ruled northern England. Yet Stephen's overall income declined sharply after 1141, and his control over currency and taxation was limited outside the southeast and East Anglia. Westminster, rather than Winchester, increasingly became the administrative centre of government. By the late 1140s, the nature of the conflict was shifting. As historian Frank Bullough noted, by the late 1140s, the civil war was over, save for sporadic clashes. In 1147, Robert of Gloucester died, and the following year, Empress Matilda left England for Normandy, diminishing Angevin influence in England. The call for the Second Crusade further altered the balance. Many Angevin supporters, including Wallerand de Beaumont, left to join the campaign. Meanwhile, barons across England sought private peace agreements to safeguard their gains. Henry Fitz-Empress, Matilda's son and the future Henry II, launched a small mercenary invasion in 1147, but it failed due to a lack of funds. Surprisingly, Stephen paid for Henry's return home, though his reasons remain unclear. Some speculate that it was an act of family courtesy, others suggest that Stephen, now contemplating an end to the war, saw value in establishing a relationship with the young Angevin heir. Henry returned in 1149, this time aiming to forge a northern alliance with Ranulph of Chester. The plan involved ceding Carlisle to the Scots in exchange for Ranulph receiving full rights over the honour of Lancaster. With Ranulph's allegiance secured, Henry planned an assault on York, likely with Scottish support. However, Stephen moved swiftly, marching north to counter the threat, and the plan fell apart. Henry returned to Normandy, where his father formally declared him duke in 1150. By then, Henry was gaining a reputation as a charismatic and capable leader. His power grew dramatically in 1152 when he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, recently divorced from Louis VII. The union gave Henry control over vast territories across France, making him a formidable political force. Underscore 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 underscore. The Succession Crisis and Stephen's Struggle with the Church, 1145 to 1152. In his final years, Stephen turned his attention to securing his son Eustace's inheritance. However, Eustace was widely disliked, notorious for his heavy taxation and extortion of his subjects. Stephen had already arranged a powerful marriage for his younger son, William, to Isabel de Warenne, Countess of Surrey. In 1148, Stephen founded Faversham Abbey as a family burial site, cementing his dynastic ambitions. Yet his relationship with the church had deteriorated. The growing reform movement sought greater ecclesiastical autonomy, challenging Stephen's authority. The conflict dated back to 1140, when Archbishop Thursdaytan of York's death triggered a struggle over his successor. Stephen and his brother Henry favoured William of York, but reformers, led by the influential Bernard of Clairvaux, backed Henry Murdoch. In 1147, Bernard convinced Pope Eugene III to depose William and install Murdoch. Furious, Stephen refused to allow Murdoch into England. When Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, defied him by consulting the Pope, Stephen seized his estates and barred his return. Meanwhile, Stephen's efforts to have Eustace crowned met fierce resistance from the Church. Only Archbishop Theobald could perform the coronation, but he refused without papal approval. After failing to strong-arm the bishops into compliance, Stephen imprisoned them, only for Theobald to escape into exile. The episode marked a nadir in Stephen's relationship with the clergy, further weakening his rule. As the war's final years played out, it became clear that Stephen's greatest challenge was no longer the battlefield, but the question of succession, one that would ultimately determine the fate of England. Treaties and Peace, 1153 to 1154. At the beginning of 1153, Henry Fitz-Empress returned to England with a modest force, bolstered by the support of key nobles such as Ranulph of Chester and Hugh Bigod. His campaign commenced with a siege of Stephen's stronghold at Malmesbury. In response, Stephen gathered his army and marched west, attempting to force Henry into a decisive engagement along the River Avon. However, harsh winter conditions made a battle untenable, leading both leaders to agree to a temporary truce. Henry took this opportunity to move northward through the Midlands, where Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, declared allegiance to his cause. Though Henry had achieved no significant military victories, his influence expanded to include the southwest, the Midlands, and much of the north of England. That summer, Stephen intensified the prolonged siege of Wallingford Castle, one of the last major Angevin fortresses. As its fall seemed imminent, Henry advanced southward to relieve the siege, countering Stephen's forces with his own. The two armies faced each other across the River Thames, prepared for battle. However, by this stage in the war, many barons on both sides were weary of conflict and reluctant to engage in open battle. Clergy members intervened to broker a truce, frustrating both Stephen and Henry but averting further bloodshed. Following the standoff at Wallingford, Stephen and Henry met privately to discuss a potential peace settlement. However, Stephen's son Eustace was furious about the compromise and withdrew from court to raise additional funds for his own military campaign. Before he could act, he fell ill and died in Cambridge in August 1153. His death conveniently removed a major obstacle to peace, as he had been Stephen's intended heir. Some historians speculate that Stephen had already begun considering alternatives to Eustace's succession, given that his son's claim had not been discussed at Wallingford. Despite sporadic fighting continuing afterward, the war's intensity had diminished. Henry seized Oxford and Stamford while Stephen dealt with Hugh Bigod's rebellion in the east. Meanwhile, Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois, and Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury took advantage of the situation to push for a permanent peace agreement. By November, Stephen and Henry met again at Winchester to finalize terms. The Treaty of Winchester, announced in the cathedral, established Henry Fitz-Empress as Stephen's adopted son and successor. In return, Henry pledged fealty to Stephen, who retained full royal authority. Stephen's surviving son, William, agreed to renounce his claim to the throne in exchange for securing his lands and titles. Key royal castles were placed under the control of mutual guarantors, and both sides agreed to disband their mercenary forces. The treaty was solemnized with a ceremonial kiss of peace. Stephen's death and the fragile peace. Though the treaty formally ended the civil war, it did not immediately ensure long-term stability. Stephen remained king, and his continued rule could have delayed Henry's ascension indefinitely. Additionally, Henry's hold on the Angevin territories in France was still tenuous. Rumors circulated in 1154 that William of Blois, Stephen's remaining son, was plotting to assassinate Henry, underscoring the uncertainty of the new order. Reasserting royal control remained a challenge. Many lands had changed hands during the war, and disputes over property and titles needed resolution. Early in 1154, Stephen embarked on a rigorous tour of England, issuing royal decrees and holding court in York to reaffirm his authority in the north. He made a concerted effort to restore royal governance in the southwest and along the Thames Valley. However, Stephen's health began to deteriorate. That summer, he travelled to Dover to meet with Thierry, Count of Flanders, possibly to settle his family's affairs. Soon after, he fell seriously ill with a stomach ailment. On October 25, 1154, he died at a priory in Dover. He was laid to rest at Faversham Abbey beside his wife, Matilda, and his son, Eustace.